Welcome to Tapping Wisdom. I'm Sue Padernacht, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Jack Zenger. Jack Zenger has been in the field of organization and leadership development for many years. I became acquainted with him over 30 years ago when he was group vice president of training companies at the Times Mirror Corporation. And I was just a, training and development person at the LA Times. So several levels below and much earlier in my career. And over the years, I've followed Jack's work. His was one of the first programs that I got certified in. As you could see, in those days, it was Zenger Miller. Today it's Zenger Folkman. And we became reacquainted this year. And I thought, what a cherished and wonderful opportunity to tap your wisdom, Jack. So what I'd like to do is pass it on to you and have you introduce yourself to our audience.
All right. Well, I'm happy to do that. So Sue is being very careful about not saying how old I am, but I'm not afraid to tell you. And that is, I just turned 89 years of age. And I am just delighted to be able to kind of keep working in a field that I really enjoy and I'm passionate about. My career has been sort of an interesting mix of academic for a few years, then corporate work, as Sue mentioned. She and I knew each other in our Times Mirror days. And then I went into the consulting external supplier kind of realm, and I've spent the last 30 or 40 years doing that. Some would say that's a career of indecision and lack of direction. I do think that the variety has been very, very helpful. So that's my biography in brief, Sue.
Okay, well, thank you. And you have some publications as well with Forbes and Harvard Business Review. So for those who are interested in doing a deeper dive in some recent work, those would be two publications where people can find you. Is that right?
That's right. And, we have been fortunate to publish, 14 or 15 books in a variety of kinds. But yes, we currently write quite regularly for Forbes and HBR.
Okay. Recently, I listened to a radio interview, which was really well done, in which you were talking about management science and how it applies to leadership and management today. And toward the end of that interview, you mentioned the importance of a culture of feedback. And I thought that would be a really important and relevant topic for 2020, 2021, and the times that we're in today. Mm-hmm. So would you share that with our group, what your passion about this is, what it is, and how it's relevant for today?
Sure. So it begins with my fundamental kind of bone deep belief that everybody that comes to work ought to have the opportunity to work for a good boss. And so that's the basic foundation of all this. It kind of begins with just a brief story that I want to tell you. So a fellow named Kevin Wilde, who used to be the chief learning officer for General Mills, he came out and spoke at one of our conferences, and a few days later he calls me on the phone and says, "Jack, I'd like you to do me a favor." I said, "Oh, what would that be?" And he said, "That presentation I gave at your conference," he said, "I'd like to have you give me one suggestion about how I could make that even better. I'm going to do it again, so I want to constantly improve it." And so luckily, I'd paid attention to what he had said, and I was able to give him one kind of, I think, useful piece of feedback on it. He thanked me very much for that. We parted company very, very quickly, and I hung up and I said to myself, now I know why you're so darn good. There's something about this willingness to kind of put yourself out, ask for feedback, that really is remarkable. And so that began my thinking about this whole idea of people asking for feedback. Now, as you know, we do some research. We have 360-degree feedback on about 1.25 million leaders all over the world. And we're able to kind of slice and dice that data. And one of the things we saw in our data was that leaders who give their colleagues feedback are looked upon more favorably. But even more favorably than giving feedback were those leaders who were perceived as asking for feedback from their colleagues. They kind of were highly elevated in the view of their colleagues. And so I guess the one behavior that really has struck me as being really an interesting, specific behavior that more leaders ought to consider adopting is the practice of asking for feedback. And I basically believe that for three big reasons, and here are my three major observations about it. I realize that a manager asking a subordinate or even a peer for feedback is, number one, an unnatural act. It's uncomfortable. For some people, it seems, counterintuitive that me asking you, my colleague or my boss or my subordinate for feedback would be a sign of weakness. Our data is very clear that is not the case. That the sign of that asking for feedback elevates you highly in the view of your subordinates. The second thing, I guess, that really strikes me about this practice is that it's one of those things where everyone wins. The manager wins because he or she gets some useful feedback about how they can be an even better leader. And secondly, they become elevated in the eyes of their subordinate to whom they ask this question. The subordinate wins because I think the social distance between leaders and subordinates, which is one of the kind of the hallmarks of our traditional hierarchy, that distance is reduced, it shrinks. So I think there's something, and the subordinate, I think, feels that he or she has been given respect. And I personally believe that one of the hallmarks of great leadership is the ability of leaders to treat the people with whom they work in a respectful manner. And it is this conveying of dignity and respect that goes so far in elevating you as a leader. The third observation I would make about this is that it really does change the culture. It was interesting that several years ago, I became acquainted with this term herd immunity. And we began talking about the notion of herd immunity in terms of developing leaders. But imagine if you had an organization where, say, 3/4 of the managers, executives in that organization, on a fairly regular basis, would meet with their subordinates and ask them for feedback. Yes, there'd be a dialogue, and they may also share some feedback, but imagine what that would do to the fundamental culture of the organization. And I'm a deep believer that that culture is a very dominant force, and one of the things that we in this profession want to help organizations do is to change their culture. But how do you go about doing that? What are the specific things you can do? And I believe that this practice of asking people for feedback is one concrete behavior that, if practiced in a much more pervasive kind of way in the organization, would make an enormous difference in its culture. Going back to the days of Douglas McGregor and the whole notions of participative management and all of that, how do you practice that? What do you do? What do you do to really put that into practice? And I believe that getting people to ask for feedback would be a very simple practice. So that's my fundamental belief. It was interesting. My colleague Joe Folkman one day was driving his son-in-law to the airport, and the son-in-law who had been just recently finished his graduate program turned to his father-in-law and said, what one piece of advice would you give to me? And Joe thought about it for a moment and said, the piece of advice I would give to you is ask your, not just your boss, ask your subordinates for feedback, ask your colleagues for feedback. It'll make you a better leader. So let me stop there and let's see what.
No, I have so many notes. We could take an hour, but I'll keep it brief.
Okay.
Probably one of the biggest questions is, it is important to ask for feedback. What are the competencies that we need to have in order to do that well, but I think first, before we have the skills, what's the mindset? Because I go to your first point about kind of the social distance and hierarchy, right? So what is the cause of that kind of discomfort, which I can share when I've asked for feedback. Early career, I could say that I was probably overconfident and I thought it would be fine. And boy, that was a surprise. I got feedback I wasn't expecting. And then later career, more recently, I was nervous about it, right? I was, I was coming in a little bit underconfident because I didn't know what my blind spots are, which, so that comes with maturity and humility. So I'm curious about mindset first. What is the mindset that new managers and to executives need to have, right? So we're speaking to leaders, and then what are the competencies, the skills that we need to have?
Well, I think the mindset, I'm sure you're familiar, and many of your listeners will be familiar with the writing of Carol Dweck and her very well done and kind of long tenured interest in the whole notion of growth mindsets versus fixed mindsets. But clearly the mindset that's required is a mindset that says, no matter how good I am, I can be better. No matter where you are in the organization, you can improve your leadership. And if you can adopt that growth mindset, that can, that's certainly the basic fundamental of it. But what a difference that makes in the organization when no matter who you are, where you are, how senior you are, or how much money you make, that you're willing to kind of seek feedback to help you become even better. The skill that's required, I think, strangely enough, is not that is not that difficult. I think the big hurdle is the very word feedback has, for many of us, very negative overtones. And it's unfortunate that we so quickly assume that when someone says, I have some feedback for you, that the assumption is, oh my goodness, what have I done wrong? And that may be because we don't practice enough of the providing positive, reaffirming praise and approbation in our daily interactions with people. But if we could somehow, over time, to dispel this notion that feedback automatically means something negative, that would go a long way. I think that the going back to the story of Kevin Wilde kind of calling me, he didn't call and say to me, Jack, I'd like you to give me a performance appraisal of how good of a person am I, or how good of a leader am I? He framed the conversation by saying, give me one suggestion for what I could do for that presentation that would make it even more effective in the future. And I think that is part of the skill here. And that is contain the area where you're asking for feedback. Clearly communicate that you're not fishing for compliments. That this is not your kind of way of getting just sort of some smoke blown at you, but that you really do want to hear something that is practical, that's actionable, that you can put into performance right away. And I think if you frame the conversation, if you ask the question in the right way, then the threat goes way down. the threat becomes much more, minimized, and you find out, oh, the value I'm going to get from this far exceeds any risk that's entailed.
I think that's so important to talk about the threat going down, because at the end of the day, there is a power differential between managers and the people who work with them and for them. So, anything that can create psychological safety, so that people aren't going to feel that there are consequences for being open, and that there's a reward for the risk of
Yeah.
being honest,
Yeah.
right? That there's going to be a positive outcome in terms of how it's going to be for them, right? Working for this person, and then that own leader's effectiveness as well. So I think that's really important for people to ask for very specific feedback. So that also begs the question, so to what extent, if as leaders we're asking for feedback, do we need to provide some kind of guidance for employees that they're asking this for, to give productive, constructive feedback?
So do we need to give guidance to employees that they should be willing to give that? Well, I think, yes, we can certainly. We've known for a long time that the best way to change people's behavior was to show them an example of someone doing it well. So part of my reason for wanting to encourage managers to ask for feedback is that if my subordinates see me asking for feedback from them, I think that greatly enhances the likelihood of them doing the same thing with the people that they work with, their colleagues and their subordinates. So I think there's no more powerful way to change behavior than modeling. And so, yes, we can encourage them to do that. And one way of encouraging them is to be that example and be that role model.
Yeah, that's really important for people to see that people are walking the talk, as they said, as the example goes. And I see your point about the threat going down, when there's a history of trust, when there's a history of respect, even at a moderate level. It doesn't even have to be extreme. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about, a lot of people over the years have been just thrown into management roles, whether it's line management or even executive management, and with no training, with no guidance, with no mentoring, with really not very good role models. Some good examples of that are people who are, say, in startups, who are functional experts. They're brilliant minds. They're focused on the market. They're focused on their product, and they're new to management or leadership. Same thing with executives. Some people are just thrown into that executive role. So when they're asking for feedback, and trust is questionable, how can they begin to build that trust back so that the feedback can be genuine and specific?
Yeah. Well, you're right. We have lots of people in senior and certainly mid-level managerial positions who have received no formal kind of development, no formal background in that at all. They've often been very good at the law or marketing or some functional area. They're good at that, and so they get promoted to a senior position, and often without any kind of development on the managerial or leadership side. I think compounding this is maybe one of my other crusades, and that is that I think organizations in general wait far too long to begin any kind of development process for their leaders. So we just have, again, we have quite a bit of data. The average age of a person participating in one of our workshops where people are receiving 360-degree feedback from their peers and subordinates and their boss. the average age of participants in our workshops, and we tend to deal with some pretty, high quality organizations. I mean, they're really world-class companies in the main. Average age, 46. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's been no development of any kind before this. I mean, there's been maybe some technical things that have happened, or maybe there's some company policy things that have happened. But in general, this is probably the first formal development that many of them have had. And imagine if the average supervisor is appointed when he or she is maybe 26, 27, somewhere around there. And the first formal development that they get is when they're 46. It doesn't take a genius mathematician to figure out, on average, we've got a lot of leaders who have been functioning for quite a long time with little or no development to prepare them for this interesting role that they have. And again, it goes back to my every employee deserves a good boss. How do we accomplish that if we don't greatly increase the scope and scale of what we're doing in terms of leadership development? But one of the practices I think that we can teach is this practice of minimizing the social distance by managers asking for feedback from their subordinates.
Yeah, I've often said that leadership at any level, from frontline to executive, is there's a lot that's counterintuitive, and it's really not for the faint of heart, right? It's not for everybody.
No, it is not.
And having had, and I would call, the kind of career you've had, a portfolio career, right? So, you've been in leadership roles too, as have I. So that, so getting those skills and knowledge earlier, in one's career makes sense. And certainly, and let's now talk about where we are today in today's environment. There's a lot more development that can happen online, and not just in classes over Zoom that are scheduled, but, just in time, whether it's micro learning, modules, or, MOOCs. There's certainly lots of opportunity to learn skills and knowledge online. So what advice would you give people who are listening to this and saying, okay, that's a good idea. How do I start?
I think that's why I specifically kind of chose this asking for feedback, because I think it's a relatively easy start. I don't think it requires any skill practice of any enormous, magnitude. I think it does require a little bit of courage. It does require a mindset that says, no matter how good I am, what my level is in the organization, I can always be better. And one way of doing that is to get good feedback from the people I work with. But it's just a matter of saying, okay, let me identify 2 or 3 people in the organization who see me in action and who could probably give me some good observations.
And I think that's so important, because selecting
Yeah.
selecting is going to be important, because not everybody's going to give constructive feedback. It could be actually quite destructive, to which we still have to say thank you regardless, right? So I think your point about selecting is really, and it not just being people who will, be nice to us, but people who will be honest and respectful. So both and, not either or.
Absolutely. So, I think the fact that Kevin Wilde called me, I appreciate the fact that he thought, here's a person who I see as a peer and who I would like to, who I know will, not be mean, and not be destructive in any way, but that may have something that, of worth to contribute. So I do think who you choose is useful, but it gets back to, fundamentally, all of leadership development is about behavior change and how do you get people to try new behavior. And I think the beginning an interaction or beginning a conversation that has as its purpose you soliciting feedback from one of your colleagues, one of your, and specifically your subordinates. I don't think that requires a special kind of skill. I think it requires, it's pretty easily done if you decide, yeah, I'm going to do that. And so the discipline is I'm going to make it a habit. I'm going to do it on a regular basis.
So it sounds like between the balance of mindset and competency, or more simply skill and will, it actually is more will than skill.
It's more will than skill. Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. I believe it is. In this case, it's more will than skill.
Yeah.
And we both know that the success of these kinds of discussions depends a lot on the relationship you have with that person. If it's a relationship that's kind of based on a solid foundation of trust and past good experiences, then it's likely to go really, really well. But I believe that the very act of asking for feedback also circles back and develops inside the asker, develops inside the person who's asking higher levels of confidence and their realization that if I hear the truth from other people, it'll be useful, it'll be helpful. I might not always like it, but I know it will be helpful, and that's the bottom line.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so Jack, since you actually opened with the big three, which is often how I close, I'll close differently this time, and that has to do with where we are today, in this virtual world. So we're a day away from New Year's Eve 2020, and we're going into 2021. Chances are, even when things shift and there is that kind of herd immunity, sorry.
Yeah.
And I loved how you talked about that with regard to the culture. Probably, groups are going to remain somewhat remote, somewhat hybrid. It'll be different from the way it was before. So asking for feedback in a remote or in a hybrid, how do you think that will help with people feeling more connected and for employees to feel more engaged with the culture in the organization?
Yeah, no, I think the physical distance. I mean, we talk about social distance. I think it's really physical distance that we're having to practice right now. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make it easier, but I think it makes it more important. And so I think the solicitation of ideas and feedback is a way of improving that bond between the manager and his or her subordinates. I think it is a signal that I still respect you, even though I'm not seeing you every day in the office, and I'm not, meeting you in the lunchroom, or I'm not meeting you around the water cooler. I think it is a way of having a useful and important conversation. And it can happen over Zoom, just as it does in person. I think there's no question that there are some benefits of being in person. And I too look forward to the day when we probably never will get back to the way things were exactly back in the early part of 2020, but we'll get back to a new normal that will be more personal, more socially connected than we are certainly right now.
And it certainly seems that your passion for asking for feedback, whether it's in this interim or in the next chapter for humanity, right, and for the future of work, right, in the workplace, it certainly seems that it will create more of a connection between people, regardless if it's virtual or if it's in person, because it means that we're literally on the same wavelength. As
It
much
does.
as it takes courage, and it's a risk on both sides,
Yes.
for people. But there is something about getting through it together and getting through it well and coming through it whole, actually makes people feel better about, about each other and about the workplace. So I think there's so much value to this, and I so appreciate you spending time with us, talking about this very, very important topic that can be used at any time and right away. So thank you very much, Jack. Do you
My
have
pleasure.
any final comments that you'd like to share before we sign off?
I guess my only final comment would be that I once again readily acknowledge that this is, for many people, a bit unnatural, a bit uncomfortable, a bit counterintuitive. But I would observe from my vantage point of 89 years, nearly all of my growth has happened when I was uncomfortable, not when I was comfortable.
Yes, isn't that true? Isn't that true? Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, Jack. Wishing you well, Happy New Year, and indeed looking forward to seeing you in person sometime in the coming months.
Thank you. My thanks and well wishes to you and all of the listeners. Okay.
Thank you. Bye
Bye
bye.
now.